Imagine waking up one morning, your body aching, a dull pain throbbing behind your eyes. The air is cold, thick with the smell of wood smoke and damp earth. You stumble to fetch water from the communal well, knowing that every drop might carry invisible dangers. Your teeth ache constantly, and a cough has settled deep in your chest, rattling with every breath. You are a woman living in 810 AD. What unimaginable health risks did you face every single day without the comfort of a single pill, a doctor's sterile office, or even a basic understanding of germs? How did women endure a world where death could strike from a simple cut, a persistent fever, or the most fundamental act of bringing new life into the world? Number 10. Complications from unregulated and harmful remedies. In the early 9th century, when a woman fell ill, her options for recovery were terrifyingly limited and often more dangerous than the ailment itself. There were no licensed pharmacies, no medical schools as we understand them today, and certainly no strict regulations on what could be sold or given as medicine. Instead, remedies were a mishmash of traditional wisdom, family recipes passed down through generations, and practices steeped in superstition. These were the times when healing often relied on a precarious blend of observation, folklore, and sometimes outright quackery. Consider a woman suffering from a high fever, her body racked with shivers and sweat. Her family, desperate to ease her suffering, might turn to a local healer, often a woman herself who possessed knowledge of herbs and charms. This healer might administer a concoction made from plants like deadly nightshade, belladonna, or henbane. These plants, while containing compounds that could indeed have physiological effects, were incredibly potent, and their active ingredients were unknown. A slightly incorrect dosage could tip the balance from a potential, albeit risky, remedy to a fatal poison. For instance, belladonna was sometimes used as a sedative or to reduce fever, but an overdose could easily lead to hallucinations, delirium, seizures, and ultimately death by respiratory failure. Imagine consuming a brew meant to calm your fever, only to find your heart racing uncontrollably and your vision blurring, knowing that every sip was a gamble with your very existence. Beyond the plant kingdom, some remedies involved less natural and even more unsettling ingredients. Historical accounts, often drawn from later medieval texts that preserved earlier practices, mention the use of substances like powdered mummy, ground animal bones, or even human excrement, believed to hold magical or curative properties. While these practices might seem bizarre and horrific to us today, they were rooted in a desperate search for healing in a world where disease was a constant, mysterious enemy. A woman suffering from a persistent stomach ailment might be advised to drink a broth containing dried animal organs, hoping to transfer the animal's strength or vitality to her own ailing body. Such practices, of course, carried enormous risks of introducing new pathogens, leading to severe food poisoning or parasitic infections, layering new suffering onto existing conditions. Bloodletting was another widely practiced cure that often did more harm than good. Rooted in ancient Greek and Roman medical theories which dominated medieval thought, the belief was that illness arose from an imbalance of the body's four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. If a woman had a fever, it was thought she had too much blood, and letting some out would restore balance. This was often done by making an incision in a vein with a sharp tool, or by applying leeches. While the sight of blood might have offered a psychological comfort, suggesting that something was actively being done to combat the illness, the physical reality was often debilitating. A woman already weakened by disease could become severely anemic from excessive blood loss, leading to dizziness, fainting, and an increased susceptibility to further infections. Tools used for bloodletting were rarely sterilized, if at all, leading to open wounds that were ripe for bacterial infection, turning a simple fever into a life-threatening septicemia. Consider the common plight of dental pain. Without dentists, a toothache could be a torment beyond imagination, often leading to abscesses and infections that could spread throughout the jaw and even to the brain. The remedies for such agony were grim. Some might try to pull the tooth themselves using crude tools like pliers or even pieces of string, often resulting in broken teeth, shattered jawbones, and horrific infections. Others might rely on topical applications of strong acids or caustics, believing they would kill the pain or decay. These substances, poorly controlled, could burn the mouth, damage healthy tissue, and lead to agonizing wounds that compounded the original problem. A woman facing such a choice between unrelenting pain and a dangerous procedure had no easy path to relief. The lack of understanding about hygiene played a critical role in the ineffectiveness of many remedies. Even if an herbal remedy had some genuine medicinal properties, its preparation in an unclean environment using unwashed hands or contaminated water could introduce bacteria or other pathogens. Poultice applied to a wound, intended to draw out infection, might instead introduce new, more virulent bacteria if the herbs were gathered from contaminated soil or the cloth used was dirty. For a woman with a festering wound, the hope of healing could quickly turn to despair as the infection worsened, leading to gangrene and limb loss, or spreading systemically throughout her body. Even remedies that seem harmless, like certain herbal teas, could be problematic. While many plants contain beneficial compounds, the dosage was never standardized. Plant that was mildly diuretic in a small amount could cause dangerous dehydration in a larger quantity. A herb that was a gentle laxative could, if overused, lead to severe electrolyte imbalance. And without knowledge of how different compounds interacted, a woman might be given several remedies at once, creating unforeseen and dangerous chemical reactions within her body. The psychological toll of these unpredictable and often harmful treatments cannot be overstated. A woman in 810 had lived in a constant state of uncertainty regarding her health. Every sniffle, every cough, every ache carried the terrifying potential of spiraling into a deadly illness, with the cures often being as frightening as the disease itself. Trust she placed in her healers was a leap of faith, built on hope and tradition rather than scientific understanding. The suffering endured, the lingering pain, and the fear of what might come next was an invisible burden carried by countless women shaping their lives and their perceptions of their own fragile existence. They navigated a medical landscape that was a dangerous wilderness, where a wrong turn in search of healing could easily lead to an early grave. Number 9. Lack of comprehensive reproductive health care beyond childbirth. While childbirth was undeniably the most perilous event in a woman's reproductive life in 810, the challenges to her reproductive health extended far beyond the birthing bed. Period before and after pregnancy, menstruation, fertility struggles, and a host of gynecological issues were largely unaddressed, misunderstood, or treated with ineffective and often harmful practices. For a woman, her reproductive organs were a source of both new life and profound vulnerability, often bringing a lifetime of silent suffering. Consider the regular menstrual cycle. For many women, menstruation was not just a monthly inconvenience, but a source of significant discomfort and even debilitating pain. Without any understanding of hormonal fluctuations, or even basic pain relief like ibuprofen, a woman suffering from severe cramps, known as dysmenorrhea, had no recourse. She might be forced to continue her strenuous daily labor, whether it was working in the fields, grinding grain, or managing a household, all while enduring agonizing abdominal pain, backaches, and headaches. Some medieval medical texts, or more accurately philosophical treatises, sometimes attributed menstrual pain to an imbalance of humors or even moral failings, adding a layer of shame and misunderstanding to a purely physiological condition. The only treatment might have been herbal concoctions that were more placebo than cure, or simply enduring it. Fertility, or the lack thereof, was another immense burden. In a society where a woman's worth was often intrinsically linked to her ability to bear children, particularly sons, infertility was a personal tragedy and a social stigma. There were no medical tests to determine the cause of infertility, no fertility treatments, and no understanding of conditions like polycystic ovary syndrome, endometriosis, or blocked fallopian tubes. A woman struggling to conceive might be subjected to superstitious rituals, prayers, or given strange potions, none of which addressed the underlying physiological issues. The emotional distress, the blame, and the constant fear of being cast aside by her husband or family would have been immense. Divorce, while not common, was possible, and a woman without children, especially sons, could find her position in society precarious, and her future bleak. Then there were the physical consequences of repeated pregnancies and deliveries, even those that were successful. Uterine prolapse, a condition where the uterus descends into or even outside the vagina, was tragically common. With no knowledge of pelvic floor exercises or surgical intervention, a woman who had given birth multiple times, especially to large babies or after prolonged labor, was highly susceptible. The heavy physical labor required of women in agrarian societies carrying heavy loads, bending, lifting, only exacerbated the condition. Imagine the constant discomfort, the feeling of something falling out, the difficulty with urination and defecation, and the chronic pain. This was a condition that could make daily life a constant agony, leading to infections, ulcerations, and a profound loss of dignity, with no effective treatment available. Women learned to simply live with it, their bodies permanently altered and suffering. Vaginal fistulas were another devastating consequence of obstructed labor, where the baby's head pressed against the birth canal for too long, cutting off blood supply and causing tissue to die. This could result in a hole forming between the vagina and the bladder, basiscovaginal fistula, or the rectum, rectovaginal fistula. The outcome was continuous leakage of urine or feces, leading to chronic infections, severe skin irritation, and an unbearable stench. A woman suffering from a fistula would be ostracized, unable to live a normal life, often confined to her home, or even abandoned by her family. There was no surgical repair, no understanding of the cause, just a lifetime of isolation and misery. The fear of such a fate must have haunted every pregnant woman. Even less dramatic, but still debilitating, were chronic vaginal infections. Without proper hygiene, clean water, or an understanding of the vaginal microbiome, bacterial vaginosis, yeast infections, and even sexually transmitted infections were rampant. Symptoms like itching, burning, discharge, and odor would have been common, causing immense discomfort and often leading to further complications if left untreated. The remedies available, like douching with harsh substances or applying irritating poultices, often made the problem worse or introduced new pathogens. Beyond these specific conditions, there was a general lack of understanding about women's bodies. Medieval medical texts were often based on ancient Greek and Roman theories that perpetuated misconceptions about female anatomy and physiology. Women were often seen as inherently weaker, more emotional, and their bodies as fundamentally different and more prone to illness. This societal view contributed to a lack of serious investigation into female-specific health issues. Pain was often dismissed, symptoms attributed to female hysteria or moral failings rather than physiological causes. A woman might complain of chronic abdominal pain, but instead of recognizing potential ovarian cysts or fibroids, healers might attribute it to wandering humors or evil spirits, offering prayers and charms rather than effective intervention. The shame and secrecy surrounding many of these conditions also prevented women from seeking help, even if effective help existed. Issues related to menstruation, fertility, and incontinence were deeply personal and often considered taboo. Women suffered in silence, their health deteriorating, their lives constrained by conditions they could not understand or cure. The burden of their reproductive health, therefore, was not just physical, but psychological and social, compounding the already immense challenges of survival in 810 AD. The body, which was meant to bring forth life, became a source of endless suffering and vulnerability, often without hope of relief. Number 8. Osteoporosis and arthritis. Imagine a life defined by relentless physical labor from childhood until death. This was the reality for most women in 810, and it took a devastating toll on their skeletal system, leading to widespread and debilitating conditions like osteoporosis and arthritis. These weren't just aches and pains. They were chronic conditions that crippled women, stole their independence, and often accelerated their demise. Osteoporosis, a disease that makes bones brittle and prone to fracture, was an invisible menace. While we now understand its link to calcium and vitamin D deficiency, hormonal changes, and genetics, medieval women lacked all this knowledge. Their diet, especially for the common folk, was often meager and unbalanced. Dairy products, a primary source of calcium, might have been consumed, but often sparingly or not consistently through the year, particularly during lean times or in regions where livestock was scarce. Vitamin D, synthesized from sunlight, was also potentially deficient. While women worked outdoors, their clothing, the often cloudy climate of northern Europe, and the short winter days meant they might not get sufficient exposure. Chronic malnutrition, a constant companion for many, further hindered bone development and maintenance. For women, the risks of osteoporosis were compounded by repeated pregnancies and lactation. Each pregnancy drained calcium from a mother's bones to build the fetal skeleton. Lactation, the process of mesking, continued this strain. A woman who bore many children, as was common in an era of high infant mortality and no birth control, would experience a significant and repeated depletion of her bone reserves. By the time she reached her 30s or 40s, her bones might be significantly weakened. A simple fall, a common occurrence during strenuous daily tasks like carrying water or working in fields, could result in a broken hip or wrist, injuries that today might be easily repaired, but were often life-threatening in 810. A broken hip, for example, meant immobility, which could quickly lead to pneumonia, pressure sores, and other fatal complications due to lack of effective medical care. Arthritis, on the other hand, was a more direct consequence of the physical demands placed on women's bodies. Osteoarthritis, the wear and tear arthritis, would have been rampant. Women spent their lives performing repetitive, often heavy tasks, grinding grain by hand for hours, carrying heavy water buckets from the well, tilling small plots of land, pounding laundry by the river, weaving and spinning wool. These activities put immense strain on joints, knees, hips, spine, wrists, and fingers. Over years and decades, the cartilage protecting these joints would erode, leading to bone rubbing against bone, causing excruciating pain, stiffness, and loss of mobility. Imagine a woman in her 40s, her hands gnarled and swollen from years of repetitive work. The simple act of grasping a tool, kneading dough, or tending to her children would become a torturous ordeal. Her knees might ache with every step, making it difficult to walk to the market or collect firewood. Her spine, constantly bent over fields or hearth, would be a source of chronic radiating pain. There was no concept of pain management beyond crude herbal remedies. No physical therapy, no joint replacements. A woman suffering from severe arthritis faced a grim future of increasing disability, dependence on others, and constant debilitating pain. Her contribution to the household, her very ability to care for herself, would diminish, placing an added burden on her family in a society where every pair of hands was vital for survival. Inflammatory arthritis, while perhaps less common than osteoarthritis, would also have existed, possibly exacerbated by chronic infections or poor diet. Conditions like rheumatoid arthritis, though not formally recognized, would have manifested as severe joint inflammation, swelling, and deformity. For such a woman, the pain would be even more intense, and the systemic effects of the disease could lead to fatigue, fever, and other internal complications, further accelerating her decline. Archaeological evidence from medieval burial sites often reveals skeletons with signs of advanced arthritis and healed fractures, particularly in women. These skeletal remains paint a grim picture of lives lived through constant physical strain and pain. The lack of proper footwear and support, leading to foot and ankle problems, also contributed to overall musculoskeletal issues. Walking barefoot or in simple sandals on uneven ground, especially while carrying loads, put undue stress on lower limb joints, leading to pain and instability that could contribute to falls and fractures. The toll of osteoporosis and arthritis was not just physical, it was deeply psychological. A woman who could no longer perform her duties efficiently might face social ostracism or be seen as a burden. Her self-worth, tied to her productivity and ability to contribute, would diminish. Constant pain would erode her spirit, making everyday life a battle. In a world without social safety nets, a woman crippled by these conditions faced a truly desperate existence, often dependent on the charity of family or community if any existed. The long, slow decline from active contributor to an invalid, marked by chronic pain and increasing helplessness, was a silent tragedy played out in countless medieval homes, a stark reminder of the unforgiving demands of a hard-scratch life on the female body. Number 7. Dental disease and abscesses. Imagine living with a constant throbbing pain in your mouth, a relentless agony that makes eating a torment and sleep a distant dream. This was the terrifying reality for countless women in 810. A dental disease was rampant and dental care non-existent. Without modern dentistry, a simple toothache could transform into a life-threatening infection, a silent killer, often overlooked in the grand narrative of medieval plagues and childbirth. The primary culprits were simple: diet and hygiene. While medieval diets varied by region and social status, sugar, in its refined form, was rare. However, diets were often rich in carbohydrates like bread, grains, and sometimes fruit, which, when combined with poor oral hygiene, created a perfect breeding ground for bacteria. There were no toothbrushes, no toothpaste, and certainly no fluoride. People might rinse their mouths with water or chew on twigs to clean their teeth, but these methods were largely ineffective against the relentless assault of plaque and acid. As a result, tooth decay was incredibly common. Small cavities would quickly grow, eroding the enamel and dentin until they reached the sensitive pulp of the tooth, causing agonizing pain. This pain could be excruciating, radiating through the jaw, temples, and even the ear. Imagine trying to perform demanding physical labor, care for children, or even just hold a conversation while experiencing such intense, unceasing pain. It would have been a daily, relentless torment that wore down the strongest of wills. But a cavity was often just the beginning of a far more dangerous journey. Once bacteria penetrated the tooth's pulp, an infection would set in, leading to a dental abscess. This is a pocket of pus that forms at the root of the tooth or in the gums. The swelling could be immense, distorting the face, making it impossible to open the mouth fully and causing fevers and chills. Pain would intensify, a relentless throbbing that would steal any semblance of peace. Without antibiotics, there was no way to fight these bacterial invaders. The infection would spread. It could travel through the jawbone, affecting surrounding teeth, or even burst through the skin, creating a draining fistula on the cheek or neck, a grotesque and painful wound. More frighteningly, the infection could spread internally. It could travel up into the sinuses, causing excruciating sinus infections, or even worse, into the bloodstream, leading to sepsis, a full-body inflammatory response that was almost universally fatal in the medieval period. Imagine a woman, her face swollen beyond recognition, feverish and delirious, succumbing not to a plague or childbirth complication, but to a seemingly simple toothache. The treatments for dental pain were brutal and ineffective. The only true relief for an infected tooth was extraction, and this was performed without anesthesia, antiseptics, or even proper tools. A local barber or a strong villager might attempt to pull the offending tooth using crude pliers or tongs. Procedure would have been agonizing, often resulting in shattered teeth, broken jawbones, and severe lacerations to the gums. The open wound left behind was then highly susceptible to further infection, introducing new bacteria into the raw tissue. It was a vicious cycle of pain, infection, and often death. Beyond extractions, desperate individuals and their healers would try anything. Charms, prayers, herbal poultices applied to the cheek, or even attempts to burn the tooth with hot irons were all recorded. Some medieval remedies involved packing the tooth with substances like mouse droppings or a mixture of herbs and urine, all of which would have either been ineffective or actively harmful, introducing more bacteria. The long-term consequences of such poor dental health were also severe. Many women would have lost multiple teeth by their 30s or 40s, making it incredibly difficult to chew food, leading to further digestive problems and malnutrition. Chronic inflammation from gum disease and abscesses would have put a constant strain on the immune system, making women more vulnerable to other diseases. Their appearance would have been significantly affected, with missing teeth and often swollen, inflamed gums, which could have social implications in a time when physical health was paramount for survival and social integration. Archaeological excavations of medieval cemeteries frequently unearth skeletal remains with extensive dental pathology, numerous cavities, abscesses, and missing teeth. These silent witnesses tell a story of immense suffering, of lives punctuated by the unbearable agony of toothaches and the constant threat of deadly dental infections. For a woman in 810, her mouth was not just for eating and speaking, it was a potential gateway for deadly diseases, a source of relentless pain that could cripple her life, and a grim reminder of the stark reality of living without basic medical knowledge. Number 6. Injuries from daily labor and accidents. Life in 810 AD was relentlessly physical, and for women this meant constant exposure to injuries from daily labor and unavoidable accidents. There were no safety regulations, no ergonomic tools, and no quick trips to the emergency room. A simple mishap could quickly escalate into a life-threatening condition, and chronic physical strain led to long-term debilitation that would horrify us today. Women were integral to the agrarian economy and household management. Their days were filled with back-breaking tasks, tilling small plots of land with basic tools, harvesting crops, grinding grain for hours using heavy millstones, fetching and carrying heavy water buckets from wells or rivers, gathering firewood, spinning and weaving wool, pounding laundry and tending to livestock. Each of these activities carried in the fields. A slip of her hand could result in a deep cut from a sickle or scythe. A heavy stone or tool dropped on her foot could cause a severe contusion or a broken bone. A splinter from handling raw wood could become deeply embedded, leading to a nasty infection. These injuries, even seemingly minor ones, were incredibly dangerous. Without antiseptics, antibiotics, or even a basic understanding of wound care, a simple cut could quickly become infected, leading to cellulitis, abscesses, or even gangrene. If gangrene set in, the only option was often amputation, a brutal procedure performed without anesthesia, often resulting in death from shock, blood loss, or subsequent infection. Carrying heavy loads was a constant part of a woman's life. Water buckets, firewood baskets of harvested crops, these burdens strained her back, shoulders, and knees. A step could lead to a severe sprain or dislocation, or even a broken bone from a fall. A woman already weakened by malnutrition or repeated pregnancies would be particularly vulnerable. Twisted ankle could mean days or weeks of immobility, preventing her from contributing to her household. which could be devastating for a family teetering on the edge of subsistence. Chronic back pain, slipped discs, and herniated discs, while not formally recognized, would have been rampant, a constant companion for women whose spines were subjected to relentless compression and twisting. Domestic accidents were also a pervasive threat. Cooking over open fires meant constant risk. A spilled pot of boiling water could cause severe scalds, leaving agonizing wounds that were susceptible to infection and scarring. Working with sharp knives for food preparation or handling hot embers, often in dimly lit huts, further increased the risk of lacerations and burns. Children, too, were often involved in household chores from a young age, and accidents involving them added to a mother's constant anxiety and workload. Beyond the immediate trauma, the lack of proper healing and rehabilitation was a major issue. A broken bone, if it healed at all, would often do so improperly, leading to deformity, chronic pain, and limited mobility. There were no casts as we know them, just crude splints made from wood and bandages, often applied without proper alignment. A woman might spend weeks or months recuperating if she survived the initial injury and subsequent infection, but often with a permanent disability that would hamper her ability to work for the rest of her life. A limb that didn't heal correctly could become a source of chronic pain, inflammation, and reduced functionality, turning a once productive woman into a dependent member of the household. Animal-related injuries were also a regular occurrence. Tending to livestock, especially large animals like cows or horses, carried the risk of kicks, bites, or being trampled. These injuries could be severe, causing internal bleeding, broken bones, or deep lacerations that were difficult to clean and prone to infection. Even small animals like chickens or pigs could inflict bites or scratches that, if neglected, could lead to serious infections. Cumulative effect of these daily injuries and constant physical strain was a lifespan characterized by chronic pain, reduced mobility, and increasing disability. There was no concept of rest or sick leave. A woman often had to work through her pain, exacerbating injuries and delaying healing. Her body was a tool, and it was worked until it broke down. Without painkillers, physical therapy, or surgical intervention, injuries that we now consider minor or easily treatable could become life-altering or fatal. Constant fear of injury, coupled with the inevitable pain and impairment, was a silent burden carried by every woman in 810, a testament to the harsh realities of survival in an unforgiving world. Number 5. Parasitic infections. In 810, the invisible world of parasites thrived, posing a constant and debilitating threat to human health, especially for women. Living in close proximity to animals, with poor sanitation, and consuming contaminated food and water, women were particularly vulnerable to a relentless assault from internal and external parasites. These organisms, though tiny, could cause chronic illness, malnutrition, and even death, silently eroding the vitality of countless lives. Internal parasites, primarily intestinal worms, were incredibly common. Roundworms, hookworms, tapeworms, and whipworms infested the digestive tracts of a vast percentage of the population. These parasites were spread through contaminated food and water, especially in environments where human and animal waste was not properly managed. Imagine a woman fetching water from a communal well that was unknowingly contaminated by human or animal feces, or preparing food with unwashed hands after working in fields fertilized with manure. The eggs of these parasites would then enter her body, hatch, and begin to steal her nutrients. The symptoms of a heavy parasitic load were debilitating. Chronic diarrhea, abdominal pain, nausea, vomiting, and a persistent feeling of weakness and fatigue were common. These worms literally competed with their human hosts for nutrients, exacerbating already prevalent malnutrition. A woman, particularly if pregnant or lactating, was already under immense nutritional strain. Presence of parasites would further deplete her body of essential vitamins and minerals, leading to severe anemia, stunted growth, and a weakened immune system. Child in her womb or at her breast would also suffer from this nutritional deficiency, impacting their development and survival. In severe cases, large worm burdens could cause intestinal blockages which were excruciatingly painful and often fatal without surgery. Imagine the constant gnawing pain, the relentless diarrhea, and the slow, insidious drain of energy that made every daily task an impossible feat. Beyond the digestive tract, other internal parasites posed significant threats. Liver flukes, acquired from eating raw or undercooked fish or aquatic plants, could cause liver damage and jaundice. Schistosomiasis, though more prevalent in certain warmer climates, could also be found where water bodies were contaminated, causing chronic blood loss and organ damage. Even seemingly minor parasites could contribute to a general state of ill health that made women more susceptible to other diseases. External parasites were an equally pervasive problem, bringing discomfort, disease, and social stigma. Lice, fleas, and mites were ubiquitous in a time before regular bathing, clean clothing, and pest control. These tiny creatures caused incessant itching, skin irritation, and could transmit other diseases. Lice, for instance, could carry the bacteria responsible for typhus, a deadly disease that caused high fever, rashes, and delirium, and often swept through populations. Flea bites could transmit the bubonic plague, though, thankfully, the major outbreaks of plague were still centuries away for Europe at this scale. Localized outbreaks were always a risk. Scabies, caused by mites, burrowing under the skin, would result in relentless, unbearable itching and unsightly rashes, leading to secondary skin infections from scratching. Imagine a woman constantly tormented by an itchy scalp, body, and skin, unable to find relief, and knowing that her condition was a visible sign of poor hygiene, potentially leading to social avoidance. The challenge of these parasitic infections was compounded by the complete lack of understanding of their life cycles. People didn't know that washing hands, boiling water, or cooking meat thoroughly could prevent infestation. Remedies for worms were often ineffective and sometimes dangerous, ranging from strong laxatives to herbal purgatives that could cause severe dehydration and electrolyte imbalance. For external parasites, methods involved picking them off manually, applying strong-smelling herbs, or even shaving hair, but these offered only temporary relief as reinfestation was almost immediate in unhygienic environments. Constant drain on a woman's vitality from parasitic infections meant chronic fatigue, reduced cognitive function, and a decreased ability to perform her demanding daily duties. Her immune system would be constantly fighting off these invaders, leaving her weakened and vulnerable to bacterial and viral infections. For a woman already facing the physical demands of childbirth and labor, the added burden of a constant parasitic battle was an invisible weight that contributed significantly to her overall poor health and shortened lifespan. The insidious nature of these infections, often silently debilitating, meant that countless women suffered without ever understanding the true enemy within, their bodies slowly consumed by creatures they couldn't even see. Number 4. Poor hygiene and resulting infections. In 810, the concept of germ theory was over 1,000 years in the future. People had no idea that invisible armies of bacteria and viruses were lurking everywhere, ready to invade their bodies through even the smallest breach. This profound ignorance, combined with truly rudimentary hygiene practices, meant that infections from the trivial to the terrifying were a constant, deadly threat, particularly for women. Consider daily life. Clean running water was a luxury that did not exist. Water for drinking, cooking, and washing was typically drawn from communal wells, rivers, or streams, which were often contaminated by human and animal waste. Latrines, if they existed at all, were usually crude pits, and open defecation was common, especially in rural areas. This meant that pathogens, including bacteria, that cause dysentery, cholera, and typhoid, were constantly circulating in the environment. A woman drawing water, preparing food, or simply existing in her village was constantly exposed. Even washing hands, if it happened, was done with contaminated water, rendering the effort useless. The lack of personal hygiene was equally critical. Regular bathing was rare, especially in colder climates, and usually involved shared, often lukewarm water, if any at all. Soap, when available, was often harsh and ineffective. Clothing was rarely washed, and often worn for long periods, becoming breeding grounds for lice, fleas, and bacteria. Menstrual hygiene was almost non-existent. Women used cloth rags, if anything, which were often not properly cleaned or disposed of, leading to unpleasant odors, skin irritation, and a heightened risk of vaginal and urinary tract infections. Imagine the discomfort, the constant itching, and the pervasive fear of infection that such conditions would bring. Skin infections were incredibly common. Cuts, scrapes, insect bites, or even minor abrasions from daily labor often became infected. Without antiseptic washes or antibiotic creams, a simple wound could quickly fester, developing into cellulitis, a painful spreading bacterial infection of the skin, or an abscess, a painful collection of pus. These infections could lead to gangrene, requiring amputation, or could spread into the bloodstream causing sepsis, which was almost universally fatal. A small scratch from a thorn while gathering firewood could be a death sentence. Urinary tract infections, UTIs, would have been rampant among women. The female anatomy makes women more susceptible to UTIs than men, and the lack of hygiene, contaminated water, and often infrequent urination due to long working hours or lack of private facilities would have contributed to their high prevalence. Symptoms like painful urination, frequent urges, and abdominal discomfort would have been a common torment. Untreated UTIs could ascend to the kidneys, causing kidney infections which were extremely painful, led to high fevers, and could result in permanent kidney damage or sepsis. A woman suffering from a chronic UTI would experience constant discomfort, fatigue, and a diminished quality of life, with no effective treatment available beyond crude herbal remedies. Eye and ear infections were also common, often due to poor hygiene and exposure to contaminated water or dust. Conjunctivitis, or pink eye, would spread easily within families and communities. Ear infections, particularly in children but also affecting adults, could be excruciatingly painful and, if untreated, lead to hearing loss or spread to the brain, causing meningitis, a deadly inflammation of the brain and spinal cord lining. Beyond individual infections, the overall unsanitary conditions contributed to widespread outbreaks of infectious diseases. Dysentery, caused by contaminated food and water, would sweep through communities, leading to severe dehydration and death, particularly among children and the elderly, but also among weakened adults. Tuberculosis, though caused by airborne bacteria, was exacerbated by overcrowded, poorly ventilated living conditions and weakened immune systems due to other infections and malnutrition. Skin conditions like impetigo, caused by staphylococcal or streptococcal bacteria, would spread rapidly, leaving painful crusted sores. Consequences of poor hygiene were not just physical, they were also profoundly social. A woman suffering from visible skin infections, chronic discharge, or the telltale signs of parasitic infestation might face social stigma and isolation. Her diminished health and constant discomfort would impact her ability to care for her family, participate in community life, and maintain her own sense of dignity. The sheer volume of suffering caused by the invisible world of microbes utterly unknown to the people of 810 NAD was a silent, relentless killer, turning everyday life into a minefield of potential infections, leaving women vulnerable and perpetually battling against unseen enemies. Number 3. Infectious diseases beyond puerperal fever. While puerperal fever was a terrifying consequence of childbirth, it was just one of many infectious diseases that relentlessly stalked women in 810 AD. The early medieval period was a biological battlefield, where contagious illnesses for which there were no vaccines, no antibiotics, and little understanding of transmission regularly decimated population. Women, often the primary caregivers and in constant close contact with children and the sick, faced an elevated risk of exposure and severe outcomes. Tuberculosis, often called the White Plague in later centuries, was a silent, pervasive killer. Caused by bacteria primarily affecting the lungs, it spread through airborne droplets from coughing and sneezing. Living conditions in 810 at small, overcrowded, poorly ventilated homes shared with animals were ideal for its transmission. A woman might develop a persistent cough, fever, night sweats, and weight loss, slowly wasting away. As the disease progressed, she would cough up blood, becoming increasingly weak and unable to perform her daily duties. There was no treatment, and the disease often took months or even years to slowly consume its victim, leaving her family helpless, witnesses to her gradual decline. Its insidious nature meant that entire families could be infected, spreading from adult to child generation after generation. Smallpox was another devastating scourge. This highly contagious viral disease caused a distinctive rash that turned into painful, pus-filled blisters, leaving survivors disfigured with pockmarks and often blind. But for many, especially women with weakened immune systems from repeated pregnancies or malnutrition, it was fatal. A woman contracting smallpox faced a high fever, severe body aches, and the agonizing eruption of lesions across her body. If she survived, she might be left with permanent disfigurement, blindness, or other debilitating complications, impacting her ability to work and her social standing. The memory of smallpox outbreaks sweeping through villages and leaving a trail of death and disfigurement would have been a constant, terrifying presence in the collective consciousness. Dysentery, a severe infection of the intestines causing bloody diarrhea, fever, and abdominal cramps, was a recurring nightmare. As discussed, it spread rapidly through contaminated food and water, a pervasive issue given the lack of sanitation. For women, who were responsible for preparing meals and fetching water, the risk of contracting and transmitting dysentery was high. Severe dehydration was the primary cause of death, especially in children. But adults, particularly women, who were already weakened by other health issues or the demands of pregnancy, were also highly vulnerable. An outbreak could decimate a household, leaving few able-bodied individuals to care for the sick and dying. Typhoid fever, another waterborne bacterial infection, presented with prolonged high fever, fatigue, abdominal pain, and sometimes a rash. It was a more insidious killer than dysentery, often lingering for weeks, slowly weakening the body and leading to complications like intestinal perforations or internal bleeding, which were universally fatal. A woman suffering from typhoid would become increasingly delirious, her body racked with fever, her family watching helplessly as her life slipped away. The plague, while its most devastating pandemic, the Black Death, was still centuries away. Endemic forms of bubonic plague existed in localized pockets, carried by fleas on rodents. Even a single outbreak could wipe out entire communities. While it did not discriminate by gender, women often living in close quarters with family and livestock and performing tasks that brought them into contact with potentially infected environments were at constant risk. The sudden onset of fever-swollen lymph nodes, buboes, and rapid progression to death would have been a terrifying prospect. Beyond these major killers, common infections like pneumonia, influenza, and various forms of parasitic infections, as discussed in Risk 5, were also constantly present. A simple cold could quickly escalate into deadly pneumonia, especially in poorly heated, damp homes. A woman with an already compromised respiratory system, perhaps from years of exposure to smoke from indoor fires, would be particularly susceptible. The lack of understanding about contagion, the absence of public health measures, and the inability to effectively treat these diseases meant that women lived in a constant state of biological vulnerability. They were not only potential victims, but also conduits for disease, carrying pathogens to their children and families. The relentless assault of infectious diseases meant that women faced not just the immediate suffering of illness, but also the profound grief of losing children, spouses, and community members. Life expectancy was short, and much of that brevity was dictated by the capricious and often devastating whims of these invisible enemies, leaving women in a constant brutal struggle for survival against pathogens they could neither see nor comprehend. Number 2, malnutrition and anemia. Imagine a life where hunger gnaws at your stomach, not just occasionally but often, a persistent companion. Imagine your body constantly craving nutrients it rarely receives, leaving you perpetually tired, weak, and vulnerable. This was the stark reality for countless women in 810 at where widespread malnutrition and its insidious consequence, anemia, were not just health risks, but fundamental conditions of existence, silently eroding their vitality and shortening their lives. The diet of the common person in the early medieval period was often meager, monotonous, and dictated by the seasons and local agricultural success. Staples typically included grains like barley, rye, or oats, usually consumed as coarse bread or porridge. The legumes, root, vegetables, and wild greens might supplement this, but fresh meat and dairy were often scarce, especially for the poorer classes. Fruits were seasonal, and their nutritional value would be lost through storage without modern preservation methods. Dietary variety was a luxury, not a given. For women, the challenges of malnutrition were uniquely amplified. They were often the last to eat, and if food was scarce, they would prioritize their husbands and children. This self-sacrifice, while noble, came at a severe cost to their own health. Chronic caloric deficiency meant they lacked the basic energy to perform their demanding daily tasks, working in the fields, grinding grain, fetching water, and managing a household. This constant fatigue made them less productive, perpetuating the cycle of poverty and food insecurity. Anemia, a condition caused by a lack of healthy red blood cells which carry oxygen to the body's tissues, was rampant due to iron deficiency. Iron is crucial for red blood cell production, and it is abundant in red meat and certain leafy greens. For women whose diets were largely grain-based and lacking in animal protein, iron intake was chronically insufficient. The demands of a woman's reproductive life further exacerbated anemia. Menstruation involved monthly blood loss, draining the body's iron reserves. Pregnancy was a massive physiological strain. A pregnant woman needed significantly more iron to support the growth of the fetus and the increased blood volume in her own body. Each pregnancy depleted her, and with no dietary supplements or medical advice, she started the next pregnancy even more depleted. Lactation, too, continued to draw upon her iron stores. A woman who bore many children, as was common in an era of high infant mortality, would be in a constant state of iron deficiency, her body slowly consumed by the demands of reproduction. The symptoms of severe anemia were debilitating: extreme fatigue, shortness of breath, dizziness, pale skin, weakness, and a rapid heartbeat. Imagine trying to carry heavy loads or labor in the fields when every step leaves you breathless and every movement feels like an immense effort. Anemia also severely compromised the immune system, leaving women far more susceptible to infectious diseases. A weakened immune system meant that a common cold could turn into pneumonia, a minor wound could lead to a deadly infection, and parasitic infestations would take a far greater toll. Beyond iron deficiency, women also suffered from deficiencies in other essential vitamins and minerals. Vitamin deficiency could lead to scurvy, causing bleeding gums, joint pain, and slow wound healing. Vitamin D deficiency. Due to limited sunlight exposure in colder climates or from veiled clothing, led to rickets in children and exacerbated bone fragility in adults, contributing to conditions like osteoporosis. B vitamin deficiencies could cause neurological issues, skin problems, and further fatigue. The long-term effects of chronic malnutrition and anemia were pervasive. It affected cognitive function, making it harder to learn and adapt. It impaired physical development, often resulting in shorter stature and weaker musculature. It contributed to higher rates of maternal mortality, as anemic women were less able to withstand the blood loss of childbirth. It also meant higher rates of infant mortality, as malnourished mothers often gave birth to underweight babies with compromised immune systems. A woman in 810 had lived in a constant battle against nutritional deficiency. Her body was always playing catch-up, always trying to repair and regenerate with insufficient building blocks. This chronic state of deprivation made her vulnerable to almost every other health risk of the era. It was a silent, relentless enemy that weakened her from within, making her life a perpetual struggle against fatigue, illness, and the very real threat of an early, preventable death. Her body was a testament to endurance, but also to the profound and lasting damage inflicted by a life lived on the brink of starvation. Number 1. Complications of childbirth and puerperal fever. Imagine the most excruciating pain you've ever experienced, amplified 100-fold, stretching for hours, sometimes days, in a dimly lit, often unsanitary space. Now imagine that agony is accompanied by the chilling realization that at any moment, either you or your baby or both could die. This was the terrifying reality of childbirth for women in 810, an event that was not just a rite of passage, but the single greatest health risk of her life, often culminating in agonizing death or lifelong disability, particularly from puerperal fever. There was no formal medical training for birth attendants. Childbirth was almost exclusively the domain of women, assisted by experienced female relatives, neighbors, or local midwives whose knowledge was a mixture of practical experience, folk remedies, and superstition. While some midwives were skilled and compassionate, their understanding of anatomy, physiology, and hygiene was virtually non-existent. The dangers began long before active labor. Poor maternal health due to chronic malnutrition and anemia, as discussed earlier, meant that many pregnant women were already weakened. Complications like eclampsia, a severe condition involving high blood pressure, seizures, and organ damage, would have been unmanageable and almost certainly fatal for both mother and child. There was no prenatal care, no way to detect potential problems like breech presentation, placenta previa, or twins, all of which dramatically increased the risk of catastrophic outcomes during labor. Once labor began, it was a test of endurance. Prolonged or obstructed labor where the baby cannot pass through the birth canal was a death sentence. Without C-sections or assisted deliveries, if the baby was too large or positioned incorrectly, both mother and child would eventually succumb to exhaustion, infection, or uterine rupture. The suffering of such a labor could last for days, often ending with the mother's death from overwhelming pain. Hemorrhage or shock, hemorrhage or severe bleeding was an immediate and terrifying risk. After delivery, the uterus needs to contract to close off blood vessels. If it failed to do so, a woman could bleed to death in minutes or hours. Without blood transfusions, intravenous fluids, or medications to stimulate uterine contractions, massive blood loss was impossible to counter. Many women, already anemic, would have succumbed quickly to even moderate blood loss. But perhaps the most insidious and widespread killer related to childbirth was puerperal fever, also known as childbed fever. This was a severe bacterial infection of the reproductive organs that typically occurred within days after childbirth. The conditions for its rampant spread were perfect. unhygienic environments, unwashed hands of birth attendants, and an open wound inside the uterus, where the placenta had detached. The bacteria, often Streptococcus, would enter the bloodstream, leading to a systemic infection, sepsis. Imagine the scene. A woman, exhausted from labor, perhaps bleeding, lying on a bed of straw or a simple mattress, often in a small crowded dwelling where animals might also reside. The midwife, having perhaps just handled animals or assisted another birth without washing her hands, performs an internal examination or helps deliver the placenta. Every touch, every unsterilized cloth or tool was a vector for deadly bacteria. Within a day or two, the mother would develop a spiking fever, chills, severe abdominal pain, and a foul-smelling discharge. Her body would become racked with pain, her mind delirious. As the infection spread, her organs would begin to shut down. There were no antibiotics, no understanding of how to fight the infection. She would slowly, agonizingly succumb to the fever, sometimes within hours, sometimes over several days, leaving behind a newborn baby and a grieving family. The infant, deprived of its mother's milk and care, would also face significantly reduced chances of survival, often dying within the first year. The emotional and psychological toll on women living under this shadow was immense. Every pregnancy was a gamble with death. Every labor was a terrifying journey into the unknown. The fear of dying in childbed, leaving behind orphan children, would have been a pervasive dread. The knowledge that even if she survived, she might be left with debilitating conditions like uterine prolapse or obstetric fistulas, as discussed earlier, was a constant haunting prospect. The maternal mortality rate in 810 is difficult to quantify precisely, but historical and archaeological data suggest it was devastatingly high, perhaps as high as 10–20% for each birth. This means that a woman who had multiple children faced a substantial cumulative risk of dying in childbirth. For a woman in 810, motherhood, while central to her identity and societal role, came at an unimaginable cost, transforming the act of bringing life into the world into a lethal roll of the dice, making childbirth and its brutal aftermath the ultimate health risk she endured without the solace of modern medicine.